Politics gone brutal. The shooting against Donald Trump is another highlight of a trend towards political violence in the US and Europe. The pictures of bloodstained Donald Trump have already become iconic for his supporters. Violence is driving radicals to what they consider the last resort to silence politicians. Just like here in Europe with the attempted assassination of Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico. How did we get there? Elections, like the ones in France, also show a shift towards the extremes to the left and to the right. The center is losing ground. On To the Point, we ask, from insult to murder, a new brutality in politics? Welcome to this week's To the Point. I'm Javier Arguedas, and I'll meet today's guests. Thibaut Madelin is the Berlin correspondent for the French business daily Les Echos. Jörg Himmelreich is a freelance journalist, a political analyst, and a honorary professor at a French university here in Berlin. And Soraya Sarhaddhi Nelson is an American journalist and the host of the Common Ground Berlin podcast. To all of you, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I'd like to start with you, Soraya. What was your first reaction when you heard about the shooting against Donald Trump? Was it just a next foreseeable step in this political violence?
It was shocking. I mean, one would argue because of the gun culture that it's a common thing. But I was fortunate enough, I guess, or unfortunate enough to wake up at 1 a.m. our time here in Germany and was able to see it sort of live, as it were. So it was quite shocking.
And do you think it was foreseeable or in any way shocking? Why?
There's so much rhetoric about violence, you would think that one wouldn't be shocked anymore. But I guess I didn't think it would be him who would be targeted. Certainly, a lot of the targets we've heard a lot about in the U.S. have been from the Democratic side of the aisle or their spouses, in the case of Nancy Pelosi. I think it was the fact that it was him, that it was so open at an event like that there was so much Secret Service, and that a 20-year-old could get that close to fire off an AR-15 rifle.
Jörg, we've also seen assassination attempts here in Europe, most recently against Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico. How do you think these two cases compare?
I think basically they are quite different. I think apart from the gun culture, which is not that developed here in Europe still as to politicians, I think the background is very different. We have a different aggressive political language, which is seems to be much more aggressive in the States in the political debates, whereas we have an increase in this in Europe as well, but I think in the United States it has a longer tradition. And I think I can't imagine luckily, that there will be an assassination of a candidate for the Prime Minister, for the German Prime Minister, or for the French President here in Europe.
But we have seen attempts to assault and even murder candidates in Germany as well, not in that high political level, but many others.
Yeah, I don't know if they are. But they, I think, have a more rare background. I think it's much less violent still in comparison with the United States. And of course, we have shootings in the early 90s of other ministers in Germany as well. But that happens as well, but I think it's not that dangerous, I think, in the debates here as in the United States.
Thibaut, Western democracies are seeing more and more violence, but also more willingness to vote for extreme political movements to the left and to the right. Do you think those two developments go hand in hand?
Yeah, I mean, probably. What we see is that the debate is becoming more and more polarized. And the capacity of people to talk with each other, if they belong to, opposite parties, is getting less and less here, I think. And to some extent, you can see that the rhetoric of the political parties, politicians, has become more and more aggressive, and you never know how far it will go. Will it stop with words, or will it go into deeds like in the States. What we've seen in the more recent political campaign in France, we had for 2 elections, European elections and parliamentary elections lately, we did see acts of violence against politicians, and to an extent that is probably new. It didn't come to that sort of violence like against Trump, but surely there is a trend in that direction.
Times certainly seem to be changing. Now, nonviolent communication may be a buzzword on social media and podcasts, but apparently not in politics. Democracy, it seems, is increasingly becoming a fight, using words and using weapons.
Shots fired on camera. U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump narrowly escapes an assassination during a campaign rally. Slovakia's head of government, Robert Fico, is hit by several bullets, leaving him critically injured. And the brutal attack against German SPD MEP Matthias Ecke in Dresden was literally a slap in the face of democracy. Attacks instead of arguments, motivated by hate, and politicians become the boogeymen. Meanwhile, the political center is suffering, like recently in France. Many voters rallied behind parties on the political fringe, the extreme left New Popular Front and the extreme right National Rally. And in Germany, Berlin is nervous about the upcoming state elections in the eastern part of the country, where the right-wing populist AfD with its hateful slogans are leading in the polls. Extreme politics. Is the political center becoming increasingly irrelevant?
Now, Thibaut, why do you think it is that what we would call a sane, moderate, inclusive political message just doesn't seem to be working anymore?
Well, I think this message has come broadly from the parties from the center, or center left, or center right, and that is parties which have been in power over the last decades. And obviously, when you're in power, you try to bring solutions to sometimes complex problems, and solutions aren't simple. Whereas populist parties on the far right or far left will tend to offer apparently simple solutions, and I think people long to that sort of discourse and swift and simple solutions, which they feel they don't have really coming from traditional parties. So that would be one explanation. But there are many factors why people will tend to vote for extreme parties. And one of them is cost of living. One of them is also migration, security. All that plays a role, and it's difficult to know what comes first. But surely, the center, right and left parties are more and more challenged in all Western democracies, I think.
Speaking of those Western democracies, Jörg, you're an expert on Russia, and you wrote a book called The German-Russia Illusion. Russia took advantage of the Trump shooting and immediately used it to point out what they consider the downfall of the West. Do you think this type of violence is a symptom of liberal democracies?
Yes, it's becoming more and more a symptom because, of course, the democratic debates have fundamentally changed due to the social media, the internet communications, and we are still not aware how this can as well abused by foreign powers like Russia, like China, and this is not a secret anymore today, but it's still difficult to really become aware of it. And of course, these weaknesses of democracies, Western democracies, to find solutions are exploited by Putin, for instance. And I think this is the big challenge as well for the established parties of the center, center-left, center-right, to really convince the people in Europe about the possibility of solutions and to talk and to point to the problems they have. The policy, in particular in Germany, I don't know, in other states, is much more to hide the problems because it's too difficult to explain them and to lose a vote in elections. And I think this is a key challenge for the established parties, really to come to a point, to point to the problems and to really try to solve it. It's the problem of the last governments, in particular in Germany, had been to hide the problems, not to be enforced to solve them.
And do you think that can also cause this aggression by voters and the citizens in itself?
Yes, because then the people need and trust in the people and the government to deliver security, for instance, as one, or to the problems of the local, regional, communal problems of migration. Yeah, and if the parties, the established parties, are even not ready to point to them and to understand the problems, apart from solving them, is already a big cause for this discontent of the people in elections, and prefer the populists' simple answers, which are as well not real.
Now, Soraya, coming back to the U.S., the Trump shooting is quite complex because it was not an obvious Biden supporter attacking the Republican candidate from what we know so far. How do you assess the way Republicans and Democrats have actually dealt with this incident?
Well, it's the usual equation where one side is blaming the other. I mean, the Republicans right away were talking about the fact that this young man had given $15 to some progressive cause. It was not abundantly clear. He also came from a quote-unquote mixed family where I think the mother was a Democrat and the father was a Republican in a community that was well-to-do. It just shows a lot of the frustrations, and I think the problem in America is that social media does drive this to some extent. The political discourse drives this to some extent, but everybody invents their own facts. It immediately is used to sort of polarize the situation, and this was no different. Even though recent surveys show that people are saying, oh, the political discourse is becoming too violent, 84% saying it's time to ratchet it down, but then what they actually do in action is something else.
Do you think all those calls for unity that we saw from Joe Biden, for instance, and other politicians also in the Republican Party were not really that honest then? Do you think they still decided to?
Well, I think they, I mean, the Republicans, I don't know who said there who was calling for unity, but I don't really hear that at the convention. We're back to blaming Joe Biden, using a phrase that was perhaps unfortunate that could be used to show that that somehow Donald Trump, should be targeted. So, yeah, I don't think they're necessarily being honest. I think that it's something that you want to say, because you think it's what people want to hear, but then it's back to business as usual, which is progressively, or I should say, it's regressing. It's not a healthy thing in a democracy.
It certainly isn't. If we take a look at the Slovakian or Slovak example, Robert Fico, the prime minister, handled the situation similarly, and it's saying that it was political rivals, the media, and even George Soros were responsible for the attack that he suffered. Is there a way of capitalizing on such a sensitive event?
Yes, of course, it's a danger to capitalizing on that. That supports the frustration of the victims, and of course he can. I mean, the best example is now Trump, how he's exploiting the situation, and he's really brilliant and using even the situation, causing this iconic picture with blood on the face and showing the feast to demonstrate the will to fight. I mean, that is probably the best political propaganda you can have, and I think this is the same with other extreme radical parties. The same. I would like again to make the difference. In the United States, I think it's more by these radicalized Republican, more a fight against the state itself, because they fight against the so-called deep state. That is, they want to take it back, the political will. This is, I think, slightly different in Europe. They are more political discontent with certain political problems that are not solved, but not such a fundamental challenge to the form of democracy we see in the United States.
When we take a look at the example in France, Thibaut, you already mentioned it at the beginning. France hasn't seen these types of attacks on high-level politicians so far, despite a very strong discontent among the French population. Why do you think that is? What's different there?
I'm not sure. We did have, there was one assassination attempt on Charles de Gaulle, but it was quite a while ago, in '62. But I don't know exactly why. It's an interesting question, why such things happen in some countries and not in other countries. What is sure France is known for, its capacity to demonstrate, go on the street. So that's probably one way to express anger and perhaps it helps. But interestingly, we don't have assassination attempts as you may have in the States. We don't have the same weapons law either. But nevertheless, the roots of the problem remain, and to some extent, even though there are differences between countries, there are also similarities or common aspects, I would say. We saw in the last election people who voted for the far right had issues with cost of living, and that's surely something with the rise of inflation we saw some in other countries. They also had issues with immigration or with the feeling of insecurity that's common to many democracies.
Soraya, the comment I've heard most after the shooting is Trump will now win the election in November. There's still a long way to go, but how do you assess the impact of this shooting and the outcome of the election?
Well, there's no doubt it gained him points in polls and surveys, and that iconic image that we've talked about a number of times is something that he's going to be able to draw on for the election. Certainly, we saw a bump for Reagan when he was shot, and it was a different dynamic, but so that does help him. But there's so much in play that we don't know. We don't know whether Joe Biden is actually going to step back. Now there seems to be some indication that he's thinking about it to some extent, but again, that's still an equation we don't know. We don't know the introduction of J.D. Vance, and what that will have. I mean, there is some popularity there. The goal, obviously, was to reach to the MAGA, Make America Great crowd that is poorer or working class, that is that comes from states, that will hopefully, or what I think Trump is hoping for, is that will cast votes his way. So we don't know about, there are still too many unknowns to be able to say definitively that Donald Trump is going to win. But there's no doubt that the shooting gave him a big boost.
We'll have to look into that future, because with or without the shooting, it seems increasingly likely, at least, that Donald Trump might return to power in 2025, a development many in Europe are concerned about. Because after 4 years of the first Trump administration, leaders here know that Trump is not exactly a fan of Europe.
What if Donald Trump wins the U.S. presidential election? In Europe, alarm bells are sounding off because Trump never hid his hostility toward the EU. During his last term in office, he called it an enemy of the USA, a brutal trading partner, and worse than China. He's also repeatedly challenged NATO, even threatening to leave the alliance. He doesn't want to protect member states delinquent in their payments. Trump has even said that Russia can do whatever it wants with them. Europeans are also worried about the impact of a second Trump term on the economy. For Trump, America first means a world trade order that prioritizes economic protectionism over a transatlantic partnership. A sense of déjà vu is being felt in Brussels. Is a divided Europe ready for more Donald Trump?
It's time for those what-ifs. Soraya, I'd like to start with you. We've heard the Republican National Convention and first ideas about a possible second Trump presidency. What would you expect from a second Trump term with regards to its policy towards the European Union?
Oh, I think Europe is going to be in for a hard time. I mean, I think that the pressure on NATO is going to be very great in terms of Germany. Jens Spahn even mentioned today, I think, that Germany has to fulfill its 2% of GDP obligation to funding its defense, and that is still not there. I think we're going to see also a lot more focus on Asia, which is something that people forget that America is not, the transatlantic relation perhaps is more important to Europe than it is to America. There is definitely an Asia pivot no matter who's in the White House, and that's going to be, I think, more pronounced. I think tariffs are coming. I think a devaluation of the dollar is coming. It's going to be a rocky ride for Europe, I'm afraid.
A rocky ride that requires unity. Thibaut, the European Union would need to stand united with a possibly hostile U.S. president. How difficult do you think that will be, considering the current political landscape here?
Well, it has been difficult in the past, and it will be surely even more difficult now. not only because the policies that will be hostile, most likely against Europe, but also because, as you say, the political landscape is become more and more fragmented. And what we see is that in France, which is the second largest economy in European Union, is very unstable. We don't have a proper government yet. We don't know for how long that will last. It may take weeks, if not months, before we have a formal government. And that will surely make it more difficult for the European Union and for France and Germany to find a common language, to build common positions, because we know we do have different interests. We have common interests, obviously, as a European Union to stand together, but we also have because of the structure of economy, different interests. In Germany, the car industry is extremely important for, if we talk about free trade. In France, it may be more luxury goods. So we'll see how that combines. But surely the fact that France is in a very unstable situation won't help. Not to talk about coming elections in Germany in September this year, but also in September next year for the parliament's elections.
Where we also have no clue what's going to happen. Of course, one leader might be pleased to hear all of this. Jörg, we're talking about Vladimir Putin, essential figure to talk about when we talk about the future of Europe. What would a return of Donald Trump mean for Russia's ambitions?
Now, Putin is certainly hoping that Trump will, to some extent, make a deal with him and accept occupations, the Russian illegal occupations of areas of Ukraine, and that he wants to demonstrate his capacity to be a peacemaker like he tried before. So this is not very good for European policy. I don't know to which extent Putin, and there's still many directions open, which policy Trump will really finally follow after a potential. Even the victory of Trump is still quite crucial. It's depending upon the voters in only 7 swing states, and so this is not clear what will the policy of Trump will be, and in particular as to foreign international policies. So even as well to Putin, but nonetheless, independently, who will win the election in Washington in November? It's finally, it's ultimately at stake now that Germany fundamentally rethinks its defense policy and culture. We still are leaving the security, the military security against foreign aggressors in Germany, of Europe, entirely on the burden of the United States. And the claim of the United States to enhance and to improve the military capacities of Germany are old, more than 30 years after the fall of the wall. Yeah, and we still hide behind our so-called historical shame that we may never be again a great military power due to the cause of the Second World War. But time is ultimately over, and I think for this, and this is independently upon Trump or Biden will win. For them, they are, as you mentioned, they are Asian powers as well, and the Asian focus is much more important since Obama pivoted to Asia, and we know this. In Germany, the politicians know this, but they want to avoid the political debate about improving of military security.
It requires a lot of investment in defense for the European Union. However, Soraya, if we listen to Donald Trump's remarks, for example, he has pledged that he would put an end to the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. What do we know about that plan, and what a peace deal that would mean?
I think he walked that back a little, that, he said it might take a little more than 24 hours. But yeah, I think it definitely, if I had to predict, I think it definitely will mean that Putin will be able to get some concessions, the land concessions he needs to be able to save face. Whether he gets to take over the entire country of Ukraine, remains to be seen. But it will be very bad news for Ukraine. It'll be very bad news for Europe in many ways. Again, I think economically it's going to be a bit of a struggle, especially if the dollar is devalued, which is being talked about quite a bit. That it will be artificially devalued. I think that would really hurt the euro in a bad way. So yeah, it's not a grim prospect, I would say.
As a business journalist, Thibaut, of course, we just heard about the challenges for the European Union, but lots of people had predicted that Donald Trump might come back to the presidency. Has Europe prepared for that potential scenario?
Well, they've prepared in a sense that they've had Donald Trump in the first place. So they know how he behaves, and they know when he says something, it follows with acts. And I guess that's the perhaps new, if you compare to 2016, where people just didn't know really what would happen. In fact, and now you can say, since last Saturday, that people in Germany, in France, are preparing far more intensively on a possible re-election of Donald Trump, and I think that's going quite intensively indeed.
It's all in the making. It's all in the future. We'll see how that goes, and we will be here to discuss it. Thank you to all three of you for being here today, and of course to you for watching. We'll see you next time. Take care and goodbye.